France, 1943. The rain hadn't stopped for many days. Mud clung to everything: boots, tracks, and the souls of men. A German recovery squad moved cautiously through the smoking ruins of what had been a crossroads outside Kasserine. In the gray, dawn light they saw it, a hulking mass of steel, half buried, still smoldering. Its turret was intact, its engine silent. At first they thought it was a new British model, but the emblem on the hull said otherwise: M4 Sherman. Lieutenant Keller ordered his men to secure it. As they approached, a gust of wind lifted the eye, smoke, revealing something strange. Despite the shell holes and the fire, the tank looked alive. Instruments unbroken, hatches sealed. The Germans didn't yet know it, but this ruined American machine was about to challenge everything they believed about engineering. For 2 years, German armor had ruled the battlefield. The Panzer III and Ike, the Tiger's brutal silhouette, symbols of mechanical supremacy. The Reich prided itself on precision, tight tolerances, complex gearboxes, weapons built like watches. But that perfection came at a cost. Tigers broke down as often as they killed. Panzers stalled in the desert heat. German tank crews learned to fear their own engines as much as Allied guns. When word reached Berlin that a captured Sherman had survived a direct hit and could still move under its own power, curiosity replaced contempt. Orders came swiftly from the top: recover the tank, ship it east, and find out how the Americans built such a thing. Weeks later, the Sherman arrived at Kummersdorf proving grounds outside Berlin, the secret heart of German weapons testing. Engineers gathered around it like surgeons around an alien corpse. They expected crude workmanship, sloppy welds, cheap steel, mass production shortcuts. What they found instead unsettled them. The armor seams were simple but strong, the transmission accessible. The radial engine started on the first try after minimal cleaning. "It should not run," one mechanic muttered, "but it does." They ran it for hours, then days. No leaks, no seizures, no overheating. "It's forgiving," said Oberengineer Hoffman, wiping oil from his hands. "It wants to work." That phrase spread through the hangar like a rumor. A machine that wanted to work, an idea utterly foreign to German engineering philosophy. As the tests continued, fascination turned to unease. Every bolt they loosened revealed another secret: standardized parts, interchangeable fittings, components that could be swapped in the field by any soldier with a wrench. It was the antithesis of German design, unrefined yet indestructible. Hoffman recorded in his notebook, "This tank is not beautiful, it is relentless." Rumors of his report reached the high command, and a quiet panic followed. If America could produce thousands of such machines, reliability itself had become a weapon. The hangar doors slammed shut against the winter wind. Spotlights bathed the Sherman in harsh white light, every rivet casting a shadow on the concrete floor. The German engineers circled it like predators around prey they couldn't quite understand. When the engine roared to life, deep, throaty, unrefined, every man in the room turned. No smoke, no grinding, just a steady growl, like a creature built to endure anything. "How?" Hoffman murmured. "How does it survive such neglect?" On the workbench lay the disassembled parts they'd already examined: filters caked in sand, spark plugs worn thin yet still functional. It wasn't just luck. It was intent. The Sherman had been designed to survive failure. Unlike Germany's precision-built Panzers, the Sherman was engineered with one philosophy: keep it simple, keep it running. American factories didn't chase perfection, they chased consistency. Every bolt, bearing, and gasket could be replaced with another from anywhere in the country. To the Germans, this was madness. How could mass production beat craftsmanship? But the numbers told the story. A Tiger tank required weeks of specialized labor. A Sherman could roll off an assembly line in less than 4 days. The Allies didn't need one perfect tank. They needed thousands of good ones, and they got them. Hoffman's report noted it coldly. "This is not a weapon of skill, it is a weapon of industry." When the team opened the gearbox, the simplicity astonished them. No intricate gearing, no delicate linkages, just rugged, replaceable components that could take punishment and still turn. Even the steel composition shocked them. Not the brittle, high-carbon alloys favored by German metallurgy, but a flexible mix that bent instead of breaking. It was as if the Americans had accepted imperfection as a design principle. Hoffman scribbled furiously in his notebook, "They build for men, not for machines." That insight burned. German doctrine believed machines were to be obeyed, perfect, demanding, uncompromising. But the Sherman forgave its operators' mistakes. It was democratic engineering. Anyone could drive it, anyone could fix it, anyone could fight in it. When the analysis was complete, the engineers sat in silence. The Sherman wasn't fast. It wasn't the most powerful. It wasn't even the best armored. But it was alive in a way no German tank was. "You could give this to a farmer," one technician said, "and he'd keep it running with a hammer and hope." They laughed nervously, but the truth weighed heavy. The tank's strength was its accessibility, the power of ordinary men wielding extraordinary reliability. And as reports from the Eastern Front poured in, of German tanks freezing, clogging, collapsing under their own precision, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. The Americans hadn't just built a tank. They'd built a philosophy, and that philosophy was winning the war. The frozen gates of Kummersdorf creaked open, revealing a snow-dusted proving ground where the Reich tested its deadliest machines. On that gray morning, the captured Sherman was hauled in under armed guard, paint-scarred, engine coughing in protest. Orders from Berlin were clear. Break it. Push the American tank until it collapsed, then dissect the wreck. The engineers smirked. They'd broken French and Soviet tanks in days. But as the sun rose, one voice whispered, "If this thing survives, the Führer must know." The words hung heavy. No one yet realized that this test, meant to humiliate, would expose a truth the German war machine could never admit, that the enemy's strength was not in steel, but in endurance. They began with the engine. Hours of continuous running at redline, oil replaced with sludge, filters removed, fuel mixed with dust and water. The Sherman shuddered but refused to die. Its radial engine, a descendant of aircraft design, screamed defiantly through the snow. "Impossible," muttered Hauptingenieur Keller, wiping frost from his goggles. "No motor should run this dirty." They doubled the load, sandbags, extra armor plates, and sent it grinding across frozen mud. Every other German prototype would have seized its transmission by now. But the Sherman simply groaned and went on. When it reached the trench pit, 3 meters deep, the driver didn't hesitate. The tank plunged, slammed, and crawled out in a storm of steam and mud. Cameras clicked. The footage would never reach propaganda reels. It was too risky. Next came the shell tests. Engineers wanted to map weak points for panzer crews, but the first 37mm rounds ricocheted from the glacis plate, sending sparks across the snow. They escalated to 50mm, then 75. The Sherman's armor cracked, dented, but the turret still turned. The powertrain still responded. "She's bleeding," Keller said quietly, "but she's not dead." Even damaged, the tank could move and fire, something German designs often couldn't claim once punctured. The men began to see it differently, not as an inferior weapon, but as a creature built to endure punishment. One engineer, his breath fogging, whispered, "If they can make 1,000 of these a month, we can't win." Night fell. The tank sat, smoking in the snow, its hull cratered with impact scars, yet its engine idled like a heartbeat. The test director closed his notebook, expression grim. "Send the report to Berlin," he ordered. "Tell them the Sherman cannot be destroyed, only stopped." But deep down, every man knew the truth. Stopping it would take more than firepower. It would take time, fuel, and lives Germany no longer had to spare. As the hangar doors clanged shut, the wind carried a low, rhythmic rumble, metal lungs still breathing in defiance. And somewhere in Berlin, another set of engineers would soon be told to find an answer to the question no one dared voice aloud. How do you defeat something that refuses to die? The Eastern Front, early 1944. The ground was frozen like iron, and the wind carried the smell of fuel and fear. Major Ernst Weber's Panzer IV rolled slowly into a repair yard outside Smolensk, its transmission screaming with every turn. Around him, dozens of tanks lay broken, gearboxes cracked, engines frozen solid, crews gathered beside campfires. A messenger arrived from the front with a damaged file, reports of American Shermans pushing through deep mud near Cherkasy. "They move when ours don't," Weber muttered, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. The mechanics nodded. "They repair them on the spot," one said. "We take ours apart for parts." Weber looked east, where the smoke of retreat rose into the gray sky, and realized something terrible. The enemy had solved the one problem Germany never could: how to keep moving when everything else breaks. Field workshops became places of confession. Mechanics begged for spare transmissions. Officers demanded miracles. Every day, more panzers were abandoned, not because of enemy fire, but because precision had failed them. Cooling systems clogged with mud, metal shrank in the cold, and bearings froze without mercy. Across the lines, captured Shermans rolled past, engines growling like tired giants but still alive. Reports reached Berlin. American tanks show extreme reliability in all terrain. The phrase repeated like a curse. In one desperate meeting, a colonel slammed his fist on the table. "We can outgun them, outthink them, but we can't outlast them." Silence followed. The room smelled of oil, sweat, and fear of an enemy built not for glory, but for endurance. In Berlin, Engineer Muller was called again. The High Command wanted to hear that the reliability problem was exaggerated by field reports. He arrived carrying 2 burned-out clutch parts, one from a Panzer V, one from a captured Sherman. He placed them on the table without a word. The Sherman's clutch, scarred but whole, could still work. The Panzer's was shattered, brittle as glass. "Gentlemen," Mueller said softly, "this is the difference between winning and losing." The officers stared at the broken metal, unwilling to meet his eyes. Pride kept them quiet. Admitting the truth meant admitting their limits. They buried the report, marked it secret, and ordered another line of Panthers to be built, machines already doomed by design. Weeks later, on the Western Front, an American column rolled through the fields of Normandy. Mud covered the Sherman's tracks, but they kept moving one after another, endless. A German air observer watching from above radioed a single phrase before the signal died: "They never stop coming." In Berlin, Mueller listened to the reports. Every victory seemed smaller, shorter, more fragile. He knew now that wars were not won by brilliance. They were won by machines that refused to quit. And as the walls around him shook under distant bombs, he realized that Germany's greatest flaw was not its engineering. It was its arrogance. Berlin, late 1944. The city's streets were filled with craters, fires glowing on the horizon. Inside a small bunker under the Tiergarten, Mueller gathered a few engineers, the only ones brave enough to face the truth. The air was thick with smoke and despair. On a battered wooden table lay drawings and photos of the Sherman. "Gentlemen," Mueller whispered, "we are watching something Germany cannot match, not yet." The men leaned closer. Outside, the boom of Allied shells echoed like a heartbeat of fate. This meeting was forbidden. To even discuss mass production and reliability was treason. But they had no choice. The Reich was falling apart under machines it had never understood. The engineers studied every bolt, gear, and spring. "If only we had designed for endurance instead of perfection," said Hoffmann, sliding a drawing across the table. They began work on Project Wiederholung, a Sherman-inspired tank that could survive mud, ice, and endless firing. But every line they drew felt like a confession. They knew the factories could not change fast enough, that Porsche and Henschel could not abandon precision in time. Still, they worked through the night. Every idea was a mix of German skill and American practicality, a design that would never reach the front before the Reich collapsed. Outside, Berlin burned. Reports came of retreating tank divisions and abandoned machines. The engineers spoke quietly now. "We are not just building a tank," Hoffmann said. "We are admitting defeat." Muller's eyes were dark with anger and respect. "No," he said. "We are saving a blueprint for survival, for our grandchildren to learn from if they exist. The room fell silent. The Sherman had humbled them, not just mechanically but philosophically, yet in that silence was a spark of respect for a machine that had done what no German design ever could: endure. By dawn, the drawings were finished, checked with care. They sealed them in metal cases and hid them deep beneath the Tiergarten, hoping they might survive. Above, Berlin burned from Allied bombs. Below, a few men had quietly written a lesson their nation could not accept. The Sherman's shadow hung over them, not as a tank but as a truth. Endurance had become a weapon. As the first light of winter entered the bunker, Muller whispered, "If only we had learned sooner, perhaps history would be different." But time has already chosen. Kummersdorf and Berlin were far apart, but the stories of the Sherman's toughness spread quickly. Engineers who had seen the tank began to share their notes in secret meetings. In smoke-filled rooms far from the high command, they studied and argued. One young engineer wrote in his book, "The machine survives because it forgives. The soldier survives because the machine endures." Outside, the war raged, and German tanks kept breaking down. The lesson was clear, but the system was too slow to change. If Panther and Tiger crews could have repaired easily, if parts were simple and strong, perhaps things would be different. But German engineering worshipped precision and perfection. Practicality was seen as weakness. Hoffmann tried to argue with his superiors, showing test results and reports. One officer shouted, "We are engineers, not mechanics. We do not copy the enemy." Yet even he looked uneasy when another telegram arrived. Shermans crossing rivers, climbing hills, still advancing. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. Panthers stuck in mud, Tigers stranded, while columns of Shermans rolled forward, their crews fixing problems in minutes. Soldiers whispered about the unbreakable American tank. Engineers compared notes in secret: interchangeable parts, flexible suspension, strong engines that could survive abuse. The truth became impossible to ignore. Victory was fading, not from lack of courage, but because endurance itself had become a weapon. By late 1944, a quiet change had begun, but too late. The Sherman was no longer just a machine, it was a symbol. Commanders, engineers, even politicians could feel its influence. In bunkers, soldiers repeated the phrase, "The Sherman runs when ours cannot." Every German attempt to mass-produce reliability failed against time. As Allied guns thundered and the Sherman columns rolled closer, the Germans faced a hard truth written in steel. Endurance had beaten ingenuity. And somewhere in Berlin, Hoffmann wrote his final note. "We learned the lesson too late. The machine that survives becomes the weapon that wins." The morning fog hung low over the fields near Caen. Unteroffizier Dietrich Klein peered from his Panther's turret, binoculars fogging with breath. Ahead, the rumble of engines grew louder, a column of American Shermans advancing steadily through the churned mud. Dietrich had faced countless tanks before: French R-35s, Soviet T-34s, captured Czech Ps KPFW, 38Ts. But this was different. The machines were unremarkable in appearance, painted in dull green, armed with modest cannons. Yet they moved without hesitation, through obstacles that would have trapped his own tanks, and returned fire even when pierced by shells. The first thought that struck him: how do they keep moving? How do they survive? At the front, awe quickly mingled with fear. Soldiers whispered tales over flickering lanterns in muddy foxholes, Shermans that escaped ambushes, tanks repaired in minutes under fire, crews that seemed to bend steel and mud to their will. One tank commander recounted seeing a Sherman's turret blown open by a Panzerfaust, yet the vehicle still managed to crawl away, turret inoperable but engine alive. The men's pride clashed with the reality before their eyes. They had been trained to trust German engineering above all. Now they faced a machine that defied their doctrine, a simple, forgiving creation that questioned the very foundation of what they believed a tank should be. Even the most hardened veterans felt unease. Sergeant Huber wrote in his journal during a brief respite, "I respect our machines, but I fear these Americans more. Not for their firepower, but for the endurance of their tanks. We can destroy 1, 2, maybe 3, but the column behind them never stops." Across the lines, German officers began reporting to Berlin with a growing sense of helplessness. Engineers who had once sneered at crude American mass production now saw the ingenuity of simplicity and reliability. Soldiers started to see each Sherman not just as an enemy tank, but as a testament to an industrial philosophy that Germany had underestimated, one that valued function over form, endurance over perfection, survivability over elegance. As night fell, the shattered countryside echoed with the distant roar of engines. The men huddled around maps and radios, haunted by the sound of tracks that never ceased. Every engagement left a growing mark on their morale. The Sherman, unremarkable in design but relentless in action, became a symbol of inevitability. Even when halted temporarily, another would take its place, as if the Allies had mastered an industrial immortality. Unteroffizier Klein closed his journal, writing the words that would follow him to the end of the war. "We are taught to fear their firepower. We will learn to fear their machines that never die." Berlin, 1944. The Luftwaffe drones hummed overhead, distant explosions rattling the windows of the Ministry of Armored Warfare. Inside, Oberingenieur Hoffmann stood before a gathering of senior engineers, sketches of Shermans and Panthers spread across a long table. "Gentlemen," he began, voice tight, "we face a machine that laughs at our perfection." Silence fell. The room, once alive with pride over complex gearboxes and precision-crafted guns, now hummed with unease. The Sherman was not faster, nor more powerful, but it refused to fail. And that simple, relentless truth challenged everything the Reich believed about engineering, hierarchy, and control. The problem wasn't talent. It was ideology. German engineering culture prized meticulous craftsmanship, exacting tolerances, and a rigid chain of command. Every component was designed to perfection. Every procedure meant to enforce discipline. Simplicity was a sin, redundancy a waste. Meanwhile, American factories churned out thousands of standardized parts that could be swapped by anyone with basic tools. When Hoffmann proposed a modular approach for German tanks, his superiors scoffed. "Precision cannot be compromised," one declared. The Sherman's endurance, born of pragmatism and iterative testing, was anathema to a system that valued aesthetic perfection over battlefield reality. Attempts to imitate the Sherman ended in frustration. Engineers built prototypes with easier-to-replace components, but bureaucratic interference slowed production. Factories accustomed to specialized labor struggled with mass standardization. Even successful concepts were discarded for fear they undermined doctrine. Field units reported that newly simplified tanks still broke down under normal conditions. Meanwhile, American columns moved inexorably forward, fueled by industrial philosophy and relentless production schedules. Hoffmann began to understand a hard truth. The Reich could innovate, but only if it abandoned pride and ideology, and pride was a luxury no one was willing to surrender. In quiet moments, Hoffmann wandered the corridors of Kummersdorf, staring at drawings of tanks that would never exist. The Sherman, scarred and captured, sat idle outside, a living monument to practicality over artistry. Each creak of its engine in the wind reminded him of a larger truth. Victory favored those who could endure, adapt, and replicate. Germany had mastered precision, but the Allies had mastered reliability. And in the endless churn of war, endurance always triumphs over elegance. Normandy, June 1944. The hedgerows shook under the roar of tanks, but not all armor was equal. German commanders cursed the mud-clogged tracks of their Panthers, while the Shermans pressed forward, seemingly indifferent to rain, shell fire, or the chaos of battle. Field radio crackled with frantic reports, engines stalling, gearboxes failing, soldiers stranded. Yet the Americans adapted, repaired, and kept moving. From the air, the difference was undeniable. Hoffmann's notes from Kummersdorf had come alive in the French countryside. It wasn't firepower alone, it was the machine's ability to endure, recover, and advance relentlessly. The Sherman didn't just fight, it outlasted. American commanders had long understood what the Germans were slow to accept. They designed their tactics around a principle born of industrial pragmatism. Machines that rarely failed could be counted on, allowing units to maneuver with confidence. Sherman platoons could absorb losses and redistribute forces without halting in advance. Spare parts were abundant, and field maintenance was straightforward. Meanwhile, German doctrine assumed flawless machines with minimal redundancy, a lethal gamble. Each breakdown slowed the entire column. Each stalled, Tiger was a target. Reliability had become a force multiplier. The Sherman multiplied manpower and morale simply by existing and functioning. The psychological impact was profound. German crews knew the might of their tanks, yet they feared the Sherman in a way they hadn't feared any machine before. A crippled Sherman could return to service. A disabled Tiger often meant abandonment or loss of precious crew. Reports trickled into Berlin. Engineers, commanders, and generals alike were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Americans had weaponized simplicity. Every battlefield where Sherman survived and advanced eroded confidence not just in German equipment, but in German doctrine. Engineers scribbled frantic corrections in notebooks. Generals drafted desperate orders, and yet the enemy continued to roll forward, resilient and unbroken. By the end of 1944, reliability was no longer a technical note, it was a strategic weapon. Every Sherman that returned from the field intact, every platoon that pressed on despite casualties, told a story the Germans could not erase. Wars were not won by brilliance alone. Endurance, adaptability, and replication mattered more than intricate craftsmanship. And in the frozen corridors of Kummersdorf, Hoffman's eyes lingered on diagrams of tanks that would never exist, haunted by the truth he had long known but could not fully convey. The Sherman had turned mechanical reliability into a force that the Reich could neither match nor counter. Berlin, early 1945. The city trembled under Allied bombing, but the real shockwaves came from within the halls of power. Confidential reports, captured from field units and enemy intelligence, lay on the desks of top engineers. Pages were yellowed, margins scribbled with notes of disbelief. Sherman tanks, battered and scarred yet operational, had outlasted entire Panther and Tiger units. Oberengineer Hoffman stood silently, staring at a photograph of a Sherman trudging through a mud-choked valley, its engine coughing but alive. The room smelled of smoke, paper, and dread. For the first time, the unthinkable thought took shape in the minds of Germany's elite. Perhaps the Americans had already won the engineering war. The Panzer Commission convened in secrecy, the air thick with fear, resentment, and the bitter taste of humiliation. Engineers debated frantically, citing German principles of precision and design superiority. Yet every field report undermined their arguments. Tigers stalled, Panthers broke, crews abandoned vehicles mid-combat, but Shermans pressed forward, adaptable, forgiving, unstoppable. A junior officer shaking finally spoke. They build for men, not for machines. Their tanks survive what ours cannot even endure. Murmurs filled the room, and for the first time, senior officers could not dismiss the evidence. The debate wasn't technical, it was existential. The Reich had built beautiful machines, but the Americans had built endurance. Hoffman was called before the High Command to summarize the findings. He spoke in a low, steady voice, each word heavier than the last. Our tanks are masterpieces of engineering, but masterpieces cannot win wars if they fail in the field. The Sherman's simplicity and reliability make it a superior weapon, not in firepower, but in persistence. Silence followed. For the first time, German engineers admitted openly that they could not match American production, not in numbers, not in durability. The confession was bitter, an internal defeat harder to swallow than any battlefield loss. Outside, the city burned, but inside, pride, long considered unbreakable, cracked irrevocably. As the final reports were archived under streng geheim, Hoffman lingered over one last photograph. A Sherman platoon advancing through a battered village, tracks dragging through debris, engines roaring defiantly. The realization was impossible to escape. It wasn't the Germans' skill that had failed, it was their philosophy. Precision had been their weapon. Endurance had been America's. And in that quiet, tense room, a single, unspoken truth settled over the men. The Sherman had already rewritten the rules of war. If Germany were to fight another day, it would require more than steel and ingenuity. It would require a humility the Reich had never possessed. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close, but the lessons of the battlefield were far from forgotten. Military engineers across the world studied photographs, blueprints, and captured reports of the Sherman tanks that had relentlessly pressed the Allies forward. The whispers in workshops and design bureaus were unanimous. The Sherman had done what no German masterpiece could. It had survived chaos. It was no longer just a tank. It was a lesson, a paradigm shift in how armored warfare would be conceived for decades. Every dent, Every replaced part, every muddy track told a story of resilience, and those stories were about to shape a generation of tank designers. Post-war, American tank engineers pored over wartime production notes, codifying the Sherman's principles: simplicity, modular components, ease of repair, and standardization. Meanwhile, German designs, once hailed as the pinnacle of mechanical perfection, served as cautionary tales. The Sherman had demonstrated that endurance, maintainability, and mass production could outweigh technical elegance or firepower alone. Countries rebuilding their militaries realized that a tank's strength wasn't just in the armor or the gun, it was in the ability to keep moving when the battlefield tried to stop it. The lesson echoed in every engineering school, every factory, every new armored vehicle blueprint: reliability wins wars. Nations took note. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and even former Axis powers incorporated these principles into their post-war designs. Tanks became less about fragile precision and more about resilience. Designers learned that field repairs, interchangeable parts, and engines that could tolerate neglect were just as crucial as firepower. The Sherman's influence was undeniable. It reshaped armored doctrine, emphasized logistics and crew sustainability, and inspired the design of vehicles that could endure decades of service. In countless ways, the Sherman became the template for modern tanks, proving that the true genius of war machines lay in their ability to survive, not just to kill. Even decades later, historians and engineers alike return to the same question: how did a mediocre tank become the standard for armored superiority? The answer lies not in the steel, the guns, or even the tracks. It lies in a philosophy that embraced imperfection, redundancy, and reliability. As armored columns roll across deserts, plains, and frozen forests today, echoes of the Sherman's legacy persist. Somewhere deep in the archives, Hoffman's notes rest quietly, a confession of defeat turned into an enduring lesson. And the suspense remains. In war, in design, in life, the most elegant machine is not always the one that survives. Years after the war, in quiet offices and dusty archives, German engineers revisited the reports, photographs, and journals of Kummersdorf. Hoffmann, Keller, Müller, they all had survived the collapse of the Reich, yet the Sherman haunted their memories. In handwritten notes tucked between ledger pages, they confessed truths they could never speak aloud during wartime: that the Americans had achieved what Germany could not technological brilliance, but unyielding reliability. One line stood out, scribbled in fading ink: "We designed machines to impress men. They designed machines to serve men." The stark contrast weighed heavily, like a shadow stretching across history. The journals revealed meticulous observations: engines that tolerated neglect, gearboxes that refused to jam, suspensions that absorbed punishment and kept moving. Each entry was a mix of awe and quiet despair. Hoffmann wrote of sleepless nights trying to reconcile German pride with this revelation. Keller detailed tests that pushed the Sherman beyond reason, only to find it endured. And Müller's reflections were philosophical. The war had been lost not to tactics, terrain, or manpower alone, but to a fundamental misunderstanding of what a machine could and should do. The Sherman had not just survived combat, it had survived the scrutiny of its enemies, and in doing so, rewritten the rules of warfare. Reading these journals, one senses the human cost of pride and perfection. Engineers who once believed in invincible designs admitted to being humbled, forced to respect a philosophy that placed functionality over elegance. Hoffmann's final note, dated 1947, captures it succinctly: "We chased the ghost of perfection and it killed us. They built to endure, we built to shine." This admission is both haunting and liberating, a recognition that true engineering is not about showing skill, but about enabling survival, efficiency, and continuity. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a lesson etched in steel, oil, and human pride. As the final pages of the journals close, one image remains vivid: a battered Sherman climbing a muddy hill in France. Engine rumbling, turret swiveling, crew inside grim but alive. It didn't matter how many hits it took, how long it ran, or how rough the terrain. It kept moving. And in that endless motion, the engineers saw the truth. Brilliance is transient. Reliability is eternal. The Sherman had outlasted, outperformed, and outlived not just its contemporaries, but the pride of the men who tried to break it. Its legacy endures, a testament that in war and in life, resilience outshines perfection, and the simplest truths often prove the most profound.